Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. This is Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and I also write spoiler alerts for the Washington Post.
And I'm Heather Hurlburt. I run the New Models of Policy Change initiative at New America, and I also write for Daily Intelligencer at New York Magazine. And we are glad to be back with you here in this August. Rumors that we took long leave of absence so we could concentrate on our role as informal clubhouse to the advisors to the Red Sox are sadly not true, but we will happily take credit for any and all wins. Get back to me about the Nationals later. It's kind of like watching American foreign policy, watching the Nationals.
That's just the worst metaphor.
But tell me I'm wrong, right? Except
the only time I've watched the Nationals this year was watching the Red Sox play the Nationals. And yeah, I was wincing watching the Nationals. So
yes, and that was not as bad as it is now. Again, except for Max Scherzer, who is going to win the Cy Young because he is going to win 20 games. Like if we have to go on the field. But now we're gonna take just a second and reenact for you the conversation that we had on trying to discuss what to discuss today.
Okay,
so Dan said,
Heather, what should we talk about today?
And I said, oh hell.
And I just laughed, and I said, I'm laughing so that way I don't cry.
So, America, here we are. We feel your pain. And we're going to start because, of course, what could possibly be more important to talk about than security clearances of former officials? Because really, who gives a damn? Or why should anyone give a damn? I mean, who ever stopped to think about that ever in the history of ever, right? Now, I have an answer for why it matters, but Dan, does this matter? I have
an answer. Does it matter for national security? I think a little bit. It is legitimately true that intelligence agencies do like to consult with people who already have security clearances, denying security clearances to former principals like former CI Director John Brennan, or the list of other intelligence officials that believe Sarah Huckabee Sanders announced were under review yesterday, is potentially problematic, particularly given the fact that, according to, I believe, NBC News, the announcement was made without any consultation whatsoever with Dan Coats, who's, no one special, just the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. The other more serious, there are two other ways in which this matters, obviously. The first is that it obviously casts a pall over the question of whether, if former intelligence officials, speak critically of the president, do they put their security clearance at risk? Again, it was striking, and, Sanders did not do well, I thought, in her press conference yesterday because she kept not being able to answer the question of why there were no Republicans on the list, when there were certain Republicans, like, let's say, I don't know, Mike Flynn, who certainly did things that might have, justified a proper review of this. But I think the biggest reveal about all of this is the fact, frankly, that the Trump White House is just so bad at trying to pretend that there's actually some abstract principle at work here. The press statement made it seem like Brennan had committed some sort of, unpardonable sins, even though the press statement was frankly badly drafted. But in some ways, Trump himself gave away the game when he talked to the Wall Street Journal yesterday afternoon, and then the interview came up today, basically saying, "Yeah, this was about Russia. It was totally about Russia. I blame Brennan." Boom. And so this really isn't anything other than another sphere of life where raw politics is interceding.
Yeah, I was going to say, I actually thought the Sarah Sanders performance achieved exactly what it was supposed to achieve, which was intimidation, which is we will yank your security clearance if we think you are behaving in a way that is a problem to us. And so the reason that you as an American should care about this is not so much because of the intelligence implications of it, but that it's another step on the road away from government by laws and sort of having the same sets of norms and standards apply to everybody, whether you like what they're saying or not. And it's another step toward, and I keep using the phrase, the cliche, because it fits here, government of men, or intimidation, authoritarian intimidation by individuals, that it
or can we say governance by fiat? Because I think that's actually what it is.
But I liked fiats.
Yeah, but I mean, this is government by presidential prerogative. I mean, I believe. I think I read. I think Bradley Moss had a piece in Lawfare about whether or not whether or not this is something Trump should do, but whether or not this is Trump legally can do. And the answer seemed to be probably, but not necessarily, because it's again done in such a capricious manner. But clearly the Constitution does endow the president with the possibility of doing something like this, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so there is the additional problem that the entire culture of security clearances and classified information is totally out of control in the post 9/11 era, and the volume of stuff that is classified and ways that it is managed is totally out of hand and ridiculous, and not sort of in line with focusing on what's really, really essential. It's more of a needle in the haystack model. But still, having said all of this, the point where individuals who were formerly highly privileged start worrying about which ranks of the highly privileged they get to stay in at the discretion of an individual is one of the sort of stations on the cross that you see in the descent into authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm. So I want to push you on this, which is I'm in no way defending what Trump did. And furthermore, I find people who say, well, this raises a valid question of why do these formers have security clearances in the first place, and are they monetizing them, to be frankly a horseshit justification, because it's a completely illegitimate way of bringing up that question, whether there's any validity to it or not.
Yes, they are monetizing them, and everybody in this country who has anything they can monetize, they monetize it. And so, yes, sure, let's have that conversation, but I should say not here.
Yeah, but furthermore, the other thing is, this is what I wrote for the Post today, is that if you look at Trump's justifications for why he revoked Brennan's security clearance, Trump has made a compelling brief for why a security clearance should be denied to Donald Trump. Because whatever you think Brennan has done, Trump has done in spades, ranging from frenzied commentary to monetizing the office. So, without in any way defending whatever, Brennan's form of discourse, it rebounds. It's a classic sort of Trump case of self-projection.
Well, and also, let's pause and note that the specific Brennan discourse that appears to have put him over the top was criticizing the president for calling one of the president's former employees and confidants, who also happens totally randomly, I'm sure, to be a black woman, a dog. And it was not Brennan's commentary on Russia. It was not Brennan, whatever else Brennan is doing out there in the world of commerce and intelligence. It was Brennan saying the president shouldn't be going around calling people dogs.
Which does prove once again that this is always and everything all about Omarosa. But I do want to ask a slightly deeper question, which is, and I know you've made this argument elsewhere, and it's a common argument I hear sometimes in the Beltway of, oh, look, this is another norm being eroded. We will never get back to where we were pre-2016. And I have to say, there are some areas where that I'm willing to entertain that possibility. This isn't one of them, though. This does strike me as an example of something where whoever president succeeds Trump is probably not going to go down this road. That we are going to see this norm essentially reconstituted, come 2021 or 2025, assuming we're alive.
Well, that is a nice way to look at it. I think it's too narrow a way to look at it, and I'll give you two examples.
Okay.
One is the incessant bubbling to the surface of behavior by ICE officials, which is, some of it is probably against the law, some of it is not against the letter of the law, but is deeply inhumane and wrong. Just the kind of casual, verbal and situational abuses of people who, in another administration, one might say are ICE's clients or are ICE's customers. Yeah. But that it's very clear that down to very low level folks feel empowered to exercise their sort of fiat of personalized authority. You can. It's much easier actually to replace a president than it is to change back a culture within any organization, public or private. And the second example I want to raise is that this is not just in the U.S. that it's empowering global bad behavior, and I recommend to viewers the essay that Peter Beinart wrote in the foreword about being detained by Israeli.
Which is also ironic. Oh, Sorry, go ahead. Keep going.
Customs and Border Service. And one of the things that they said to him was, oh, you think we're mistreating you? Do you, this is what you do in the U.S. to people who try to come to your country.
Yes. So, again, just to clarify, I agree with you that there are certain areas where, in fact, it's a genuinely valid question to ask if we're going to be able to return to the prior status quo. I'm just saying that on the question of, presidents deciding personally whether formers will have security clearances or not, that's not one of them. I think this is one of those things where people who bemoan the erosion of norms, maybe it's anomalous, but I just don't think it's going to happen again.
Yeah, I don't think the subject matter erosion of norms is as simple as this one discrete norm.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely.
This is another. But speaking of norms and rules and whether we can ever get the hell back or what it is we will have in our hands at the end of this administration. Dan, during our long hiatus, there's been lots of really interesting developments in that borderlands between economics and security that you and I both love to patrol. So, this week we have, basically U.S. sanctions are collapsing the Turkish economy, which is interesting. The European Union came to Washington and pretended to offer some concessions in order to slow down the U.S.-Europe trade war, and then amusingly went home and promptly everyone went on vacation just like they always do. So there was a great news story about how actually no one in Europe is doing any work toward the immediate resumption of really awesome trade talks that Trump talked about. And third, the rumor mill, this has happened every couple months for the last 6 months, but the rumor mill is heating up that we're about to see that famous new NAFTA deal. So
fourth,
lots of movement.
Also, fourth, probably in the next couple of weeks, we are going to see a decision on whether or not the administration is actually going to apply tariffs on automobiles, which for all of the bad tariff and trade actions that have been taken in 2018, they are all dwarfed if, in fact, the Trump administration imposes tariffs on automobiles. It's a much larger sector of the economy. It would have much larger macroeconomic effects. So, yes, this is I was looking around my desk because, I was sipping a lovely iced coffee, and by moving to trade, I now need to find the hard liquor that I keep somewhere around here to go to that, because it's not going to go well. Yeah, I need the. Are you watching Sharp Objects?
I am not, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay. Because Amy Adams plays an alcoholic, and she has like an Evian bottle that is clearly filled with vodka. So I need one of those as well, apparently. So yeah, it is a bad year for the trade wars, or rather, a great year if you want trade wars. And I'm not sure what I can. Let me put it this way: I would say a couple of things. The first is that I am legit surprised at the degree to which the administration has tried to carry out this sort of strategy, even though it's very divided internally on how to deal with these kinds of things. It's divided in terms of the European Union, and it's divided in terms of how to handle China on this stuff. Second, it's not like it's all that popular. And it's particularly unpopular, I would add, in places where Trump ostensibly wants to do well politically, such as the Midwest. And indeed, the very fact that it's hurting things like soybean farmers demonstrates that he's actually genuinely hurting his base with this move. And for all the stories that you see about, factories where workers are going out, are losing their jobs, but they'll stick with Trump because he's a fighter, that'll work if this stuff gets resolved in the next couple of months. But I see no evidence whatsoever that it'll get resolved in the next couple of months. Indeed, if anything, the EU move from last month is probably going to convince countries like Japan and so on and so forth to say symbolically, we'll be happy to talk with you, and then string things out as long as possible. And in some ways, Trump is their enabler on this, because the moment they make some sort of announcement, Trump inevitably does a 180 where he goes from saying, I've been really, really tough, to I have just negotiated the greatest trade deal ever. And so as a result, by doing that, he winds up locking himself into a apparent victory. And he's been doing this not just on trade, but on any kind of negotiation, where he proclaims the initial announcement as the grand success without realizing that there's usually a whole lot of follow through that has to be done, and very often it won't be done. So the one way in which I am weirdly optimistic about all of this, well, I suppose there are two ways. Way one is that this has yet to have actual real-world effects on the economy. I mean, it definitely has had sectoral effects. If you're a soybean farmer, you're not happy right now. But it hasn't caused, the overall economy to slag off, or it hasn't imposed a significant drag on growth yet. Possibly, and here I'm going to be speculating, I think it's because markets are actually underestimating the possibility of a big blow-up. But the second reason I'm weirdly optimistic is that Trump has actually single-handedly managed to invert public opinion on trade, which is impressive. Which is to say that, it used to be the case, if we were having this conversation a decade ago, we would be talking about why is it that elites are big fans of free trade, whereas the public is profoundly skeptical. It's actually now reversed, in which the Trump administration is very skeptical about trade, but the public has been ever increasingly enthusiastic about the idea of trade. And so as a result, they aren't big fans of any of these actions.
Yeah, I look at that public opinion data, and what I think is happening is that Democrats have become more supportive of trade because Trump opposes it.
That's partly what's going on.
Republicans have become more supportive of trade because by trade they mean what Trump is doing. And one of the real sort of challenges I think we have about picking up the pieces of international economic policy is that we, the public, means all kinds of different things when you ask it about trade, and we tend not to know. So in sort of politicians making either a totally cynical political effort or a good faith effort or both to understand what the public thinks, like just the survey data that we have really don't tell us very much.
Well, okay, so I'm going to push back on this, and I have to say I'm prepped on this because I literally just yesterday I'm on the board.
I knew when you said you'd been hanging out with Dina.
Yeah.
A note to folks that the Chicago Council's polling data is one of the sort of mother loads of things for national security folks to argue about. So go check them out.
Right, and I'm on the board of advisors that oversees the survey. So the report's not going to come out for a few months, but I've seen the preliminary results. The one pushback, a few pieces of pushback. One is it's not just your story would make sense for Republicans, and your story also potentially makes sense for Democrats. It doesn't explain independents, though, and independents are moving in the exact same direction. Now, you can argue there are no real independents, but I actually don't quite buy that.
That's exactly what I was going.
I knew you were going to say that, but the truth is that, and furthermore, if you break down Republicans between like sort of Trump diehards, the Trump base, and more skeptical ones, it also still trends in the same direction in terms of trade. So I'm not saying that your story is completely baseless. I'm saying that I do think there's something else going on here, which is in some ways what Trump is doing is forcing a whole bunch of people to suddenly appreciate, in the words of Jim Lindsay from Council on Foreign Relations, the value of oxygen, which is to say we take oxygen for granted. We breathe it. We need it essentially for our, to be able to live. We never think about whether or not we have a sufficient supply of it right up until the moment that we might be in a situation where it is actually threatened. And I think in some ways the same is true with respect to trade, which is for a long time I think it was taken for granted. And now what you are seeing in terms of the Trump administration's efforts to reshape the trade landscape is, a corporate sector that used to be relatively blasé about this suddenly, making aggressive arguments in favor of trade. And even more intriguingly to me, you actually have unions now saying that we've gone too far, which is legit unprecedented in my lifetime. And so it's one of these things where I actually think the administration is trying to follow through on the promises that Trump made as a candidate, but I think they've actually lost the case in terms of the public.
Well, I was just reflecting on, since you and I share the same birth year, in a big round one it is, I was, that in fact, when we were born is just about when, unions had been huge boosters of exporting through the 50s and much of the 60s. And something that I think, is not true, for example, in the automotive sector, but that is true in the agricultural sector. And I have a piece that will come out sometime soon at the National Interest that makes this point. We don't appreciate, and I think Trump doesn't appreciate, the extent to which some American sectors now simply can't exist without exporting. That the pork sector, the dairy sector, the soybean sector were all under huge pressure even before the tariffs because international prices are too low. And the U.S. market can't possibly absorb. My favorite statistic was that pork production shot up last year in a way that, even the sort of pork industry magazine was like, we can't understand why large pork producers are adding so much production. The only way this works is if we can export more. So
what are the names of pork industry magazines? I'm just curious.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I Googled it and I read it for
now. Oh, I'm dying. What is it, like Bovine University? I mean, or no, not Bovine. That doesn't make any
Bovine.
sense. Porcine University. Exactly.
No,
Sorry,
but the all of our politics all the way across, from what Trump says to his supporters to what unions say to their supporters and everybody else are not premised on the idea that the U.S. economy is now built in a way that it's really export or die. In a lot of sectors.
It's not just that, by the way. It's also that our export, the one thing that comes through loud and clear in the surveys is that, you're right. Trump supporters are actually more enthusiastic about trade, but they're enthusiastic about it in a mercantilist way, which is they think they want to export more and therefore Trump's trade policies will enable that. It overlooks the fact that an awful damn lot of our exports consist of imports. Which is to say the way the global supply chain works now, if if Boeing exports a plane or GM exports a car, there are component parts, relatively important component parts of those things that are not coming from the United States. They're coming from Mexico or China or some other part of the global supply chain, and that can't be redrawn as easily as Trump would think. And as further evidence for this, the fact that Harley-Davidson is shifting its production of exports overseas because they don't need the headache of dealing with final assembly here.
Well, and indeed, one of the key sticking points in the NAFTA renegotiation talks has been what percentage of Mexican components can be in an American car that counts as an American car. Do you have a prediction of whether we actually get a NAFTA deal this time, or whether this is a false alarm like the last 3 times that people looked at me earnestly and said, no, they're really going to get a deal this time?
Yeah, all right, so this is lazy, but I'm going with false alarm. I simply don't believe, among other things, I assume that one of the sticking points that is not going to get resolved is the sunset clause. Because that's an insane provision that the U.S. seems to be making, which is we'll negotiate and it'll expire after 5 years. Regardless of what they feel about the deal, there is simply no way the Mexicans and the Canadians are going to invest this much effort just to have to go through this again in 5 years. That I'm extremely dubious about that. And I suspect that that's been one of the things that's been high profile enough so that Trump will eventually scotch, even if a deal is made at the negotiator level, Trump will veto it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I see where, 5 years on something that in a normal world takes you 2 years plus to negotiate is a problem. But, we have had the problems in a number of sectors of places where deals were negotiated and then the world changed. So, for example, it shouldn't have taken this many years to renegotiate NAFTA and address some of the difficulties. So you do actually need, and our institutions are getting so hidebound. You really do need the ability to say, oh, this is kicking the crap out of this sector or this region in a way we didn't anticipate. We need to be able to renegotiate.
Well, there are things like snapback provisions and or escape clauses that would presumably take care of that. But your point is a deeper one, which is to negotiate this kind of deal, you in some ways want to routinize. Renegotiation is not quite the way you'd want to put it. What you'd want to be able to have is a mechanism where, let's say, every 5 or 10 years or so, because economics change, because technologies change, you would revisit the core questions and think, okay, what do we need? Much like a major domestic piece of legislation constantly requires amendments and renewal, you would want that similar sort of provision, potentially for NAFTA. But what you wouldn't want to do is to get Congress involved every time, because that's the part where it becomes an incredibly heavy political lift. And if you're a president, you don't want to have to invest this kind of time or effort in doing that. So my point, though, is that I don't think it's going to fly. I think the more interesting question politically is there is a degree to which Trump has been able to keep Republicans on his side on this question because he's been able to pitch 2 different arguments to 2 different groups of Republicans. Argument one is just the out-and-out protectionism argument of tariffs are the greatest and, trade wars are good and so on and so forth. And these are people that just don't want to trade. They want protection and they want it to be a permanent feature of the U.S. circa the 19th century, and therefore, what Trump is doing is the greatest. The second group, and this is more tactical, acknowledges that they don't want tariffs, but they also acknowledge that raising tariffs are a bargaining principle or a bargaining tool through which you can potentially, negotiate a greater deal. And so they've been able to at least say for the midterms, look, just be patient. Got the best negotiators. They'll eventually negotiate a deal, and then, if it takes a couple months of pain, then it'll be fine down the road. That has worked up till now. I think they've got until the end of the calendar year for that to play. But if we are in 2019 and we are still seeing all these kinds of tariffs and no evidence of forward progress, which, by the way, is where I think we're going to be, then suddenly that argument ceases to make much sense. And you're going to have, potentially a Congress that will be, let's say, be more willing to exercise its authority on these questions, which will also be interesting. And I think in some ways, much as everything, this all boils down to the midterms as a signal of whether or not the public actually buys this argument.
Yeah, I'm not actually sure that what you're going to be able to read. I think the tea leaves are going to be pretty muddy on trade. And I mean, also because I would have added sort of yet another school, which says it's tariffs are one among a number of tools that can be used in international economic policy. And altogether, the U.S. should be using a range of tools more than it was willing to in at least the last one, if not the last two administrations. And that maybe there was a model of how much restraint the U.S. should have that, again, harkened back to a different time with a different degree of U.S. preeminence. That's no longer the case. So you have those folks saying, and I think of, everybody from, say, Jennifer Harris, Hewlett, who's certainly not a Trumpist in any way, shape, or form, to some of the union arguments, to also some of, I think this is the line that some of the more isolated, quote unquote, moderates within the Trump administration would take and say, there's a greater role for attempts at enforcement than we saw, sort of under the Froman USTR, but that's a very technocratic. It's very focused on sort of what are the realities of international economic power and how can you have impact on it. And you don't see anybody on either side of the aisle who's really been able to turn that into something to talk to the public about. So I think that you're going to get a muddled mess.
Well, yeah, and this raises the bigger macro point, which is, even on issues where the Trump administration might have a valid case to make that the status quo prior to them coming in office was not great, the administration's own incompetence on these questions, and I assume that you would agree with me that they haven't handled any of this terribly well, winds up sort of impeaching even the potentially valid critiques of that pre-existing order, or it makes it more difficult for those who want to argue for reform, because they inevitably then get associated with this sort of Trumpist, scorched earth policy.
Yeah, and I think the other side of that is the way that the Trump's actions are actually dismantling the architecture that you could use to implement any kind of international economic policy, sort of whichever of these schools you came from. So, the WTO, where the U.S. is no longer appointing officials, where the rest of the world comes and says, well, gee, the way you're using national security exemptions, it's not clear to us that you believe in the foundational principles of this thing. And, so there's this interesting moment where one could want to use the WTO to move in several different directions, but the WTO is one of a number of pieces.
It's being innovated. Yeah.
It's really unclear.
So, let me ask you something, because you probably have a better answer to this than I do. Because this is a lovely way to segue to sort of larger questions about the future of the liberal international order. But assume for the moment that the midterms wind up with a what looks like a wholesale rejection for Trump. They lose the House. If they keep control of the Senate, it's by a bare majority, huge gains by Democrats and governorships and so on and so forth. It's read as a repudiation of the Trumpist political platform. Do you think that a Congress that is, where at least the Democrats control one House, potentially two, winds up, potentially acting as more of a fire break against further destruction of international institutions? Or, in fact, is it because it's Congress And they've been so used to deferring to the executive branch for so goddamn long, it's not going to change anything.
So, no is my short answer. It's not going to help very much.
Okay.
And my reasons for that are that actually the places where the most destruction, I think, can come are places where Congress is least well equipped to intervene. So,
even on trade, where constitutionally they can intervene.
Congress can't force the president to appoint people, arbiters to the WTO. Congress, I mean, it'll be interesting. I think, people have had some interesting and creative ideas about which powers Congress could take back on trade, but with two closely divided houses and a lot of new blue members in red districts. And as we alluded to earlier, both parties somewhat divided on what good trade looks like. I mean, Congress can't help you save the WTO. Congress can pass resolutions saying you can't pull out of NATO. Congress can't stop, the president from throwing Starburst candy at our allies. Congress can't, and some of the things where I think the most harm can be done at the UN. It's asking a lot to ask a freshman Democrat in a red district, vote to restore UN funding that the president cut. So, I'm normally the person who argues that Congress could and should do a lot more. Congress can't make the president go back to the Iran deal. It can't make him talk to our allies about that. It can't, it can't mandate how we deal with Japan or South Korea around North Korea. So, no.
Okay, well, this then raises this is a natural segue to the next and last question we need to tackle, which is, maybe it's my imagination, but this summer has seen a fair number of essays, including some by you, about the fact that Trump has been more successful at damaging the liberal international order than perhaps people realized, or would have expected a year or two ago. And this, in some ways, I think, has given rise to two different kinds of debates. Debate one is whether the liberal international order is even worth preserving, and there are a whole variety of essays. I'm thinking ones by Patrick Porter for Cato and Paul Stanland, I think, for Lawfare, suggesting that, in fact, those defenders of the liberal international order are sort of presenting a very nostalgic, rose-colored view of those kinds of structures without realizing that there were fundamental problems that led to the political earthquake of 2016 in the first place. And then the question is that even regardless of whether that's true, damage is going to be done. What can be done, post-Trump? Can there be a post-Trump order that, if perhaps is not the same as the liberal international order, is nonetheless one that actually serves U.S. interests in terms of promoting security and prosperity?
Yeah, so this has been a very interesting debate. To the articles you mentioned, there was one by Mira Rapp-Hooper and Rebecca Lisner, which I think appeared in the Washington Quarterly. Is that where that was? Which is worth checking out.
I'm going to check that out. I don't think I have looked at it, so yeah.
And I published a piece at Lawfare myself that was trying to be a bit more forward-looking. And I also am proud. I feel like the intellectual godmother of a piece that actually Bruce Jentleson published at Democracy Journal as part of a symposium that I put together back in the spring. But I have to say, I am a little bit bored of the let's argue about whether the international liberal order was good or bad, and let's argue about how liberal it was, and let's argue about whether the United States was acting in its own self-interest or not. Like, of course it was. Can we now move on, please? There's also a Graham Allison one, which I think has some important flaws, and I also think that some of the Thucydides stuff, I'm not sure. Well, anyway, there's also a Graham Allison piece on the topic.
Yes, there is. Let's move on.
So moving on, I think the next phase of this conversation that I'd like to see is, so what are the things about the international liberal order that the U.S. wants to keep? What are the things that it does for us that we'll really miss when they're gone? Number one. And number two, what are the pieces that are actually working pretty well without us and or others have a major interest in preserving, so they will be preserved anyway? So, sort of actually going out and taking the depth soundings about what's there and what's not. And that's where I think our beloved people of the blob, including the ones who very proudly think that they're outside of the blob, including many of the people we just named, we aren't always as forward-looking as we need to be. And this is, so, for example, Mark Lynch has a piece out about sort of, here's what the new security order looks like in the Middle East. You might not like it, but you need to acknowledge that it's there. Yeah. There was a whole bunch of writing on both sides of the Atlantic about the German debate over whether to get a nuclear weapon or not. Now, no, Germany is not going to get a nuclear weapon in the next 6 months. But the fact that that's now a scholarly debate that's happening tells you something really big has shifted in European security that you're planning and thinking about the future of NATO needs to take into account. Also, by the way, Turkey sort of really moving itself pretty thoroughly out of the democratic column and also pretty thoroughly into the, like, we are mad at the U.S. all the time column, has major strategic implications for Europe and the Middle East.
So, wait, you want a substantive answer to all this? So I guess I would have a few thoughts. I mean, in some ways, I would break it down into sort of three baskets to get all Helsinki on you, which is there's the security sphere, there's the economic sphere, and there's the sort of democracy and human rights sphere. On the security sphere side of things, you can argue that U.S. interests have actually been served pretty damn well by the sort of international security architecture that exists. That indeed most of the problems with respect to the U.S. have been own goals, such as the never-ending war in Afghanistan and the sort of imbroglio in Syria and so on and so forth. I don't think that even Trump necessarily wants to get rid of NATO or the Pacific Rim alliances or what have you. And furthermore, if nothing else, I think we've got evidence that over the last couple of years, it turns out that the Europeans don't want to get rid of these things, and our allies don't want to get rid of these things either. That they have, to use technical terms, they've had to put up with a lot of shit for the last 2 years, and nonetheless are doing so. And so it might be the case that the security architecture will probably endure, despite Trump's, best efforts at disrupting it. And this is where, in fact, I would acknowledge the point that even the NATO summit that happened this last summer, even though a disaster on PR terms, in terms of the way that Trump handled it, there was substantive stuff achieved at the, in terms of the NATO communique. And indeed, I'm going to do something extremely rare here. I'm going to praise John Bolton, which is, the reports that I've heard suggested that what Bolton tried to make sure was that the communique was locked down and agreed upon by everyone before Trump ever got there. Which is unorthodox in terms of a NATO communique, but he did it because he knew that way Trump couldn't, disrupt everything. Do you want to respond to that, or should I keep going?
No, I was actually going to let you get through your other two buckets.
Okay, so quickly, in terms of economics, that's a more interesting one where you could argue the problem there is that actually most of the rest of the world has an incentive to keep the system as we know it in place, but that's also the one where, as you say, at least in the past, there has been some discontent within the United States about the way the system worked. And so an interesting question going forward will be, can that be renegotiated on terms more favorable to the United States? While at the same time, unfortunately, you have a country like China, which is now in the last year started articulating a different set of beliefs and actually proselytizing them in a way which it had not even a couple of years ago. And then finally, on the democracy and human rights, in some ways, I think this is the biggest difference maker that Trump has had in terms of being president, which is the degree to which the administration just does not give a rat's ass about these issues. That in terms of either democracy promotion or human rights, unless the countries are named North Korea, Iran, or Cuba, they are never going to talk about them. And I used to think of myself as a pretty realist kind of guy, but I have to admit, it is depressing. This is where I think you said something before about like people who think of themselves in the blob or people who think of themselves as critics of the blob. I'm going to be very intrigued going forward about whether or not people who might have been really ardent critics of the whole democracy promotion, human rights promotion thing, in no small part because it got tied up with Iraq in the last decade, now recognize that there is actually a value to the United States, proselytizing these views, even if just in terms of proselytizing, it doesn't automatically get accepted everywhere. Just because, you need a cheerleader for these kinds of values, in terms of rallying democratic or human rights activists in authoritarian countries, or in countries where the government is contemplating more authoritarian moves. And I think in some ways that's the area where I will be curious to see whether a post-Trump world actually, whether U.S. boosterism for that topic will make a difference.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with your last point. And I think something that is, in many ways, its great genius was not anything that it did, but precisely that it held space open for civil society concerns, whether it was democracy or human rights, whether it was environmentalism or consumer rights or privacy protections. And that in some ways, the whole third bucket, to use the Helsinki nomenclature, is this negative space, or it's actually creating space within which non-governmental activity can flourish, creating the expectation in societies that didn't have this, that you should have flourishing non-governmental activity. And then, both sort of inconsistently, intermittently, but sometimes helpfully speaking up for it, and actually holding open the space from within which people could critique and challenge us.
Yes.
And quite successfully sometimes, and on big things like the Landmines Treaty, right, or the sort of changing of the American position on climate change.
Or the very fact the system allowed and tolerated criticism of the hegemon is in some ways one of the things that made it resilient. It actually it inculcated a sense of buy-in from other actors that, while recognizing they weren't the most powerful actor in the system, they did have a voice, and that voice actually mattered.
Yes, and there's that to me is the biggest thing, realist or whatever you want to call it, sort of the critique of, we won't miss the liberal international order because it did all these terrible things. Well, the thing about it is, even as it was doing all these terrible things, it held open the space for it to be criticized and challenged. And if you look at the China model or the Gulfy model,
or the Russian model,
or the Russia model, you're really gonna miss that space. But I think a small cause for optimism is that, again, among the many actors that are also out there sort of fighting for their version of the order are a lot of both state and non-state actors that did kind of grow their strength in that space. So, if you have an analysis that lets you look for those forces, then you see them and they matter. But if you insist on having an analysis that doesn't, and I should say there are also plenty of negative forces that grew up in that space. It's not, right, this is also what gives you Al-Qaeda, and it's also what gives you,
it's the dark civil society, if you want to put
corporations stealing all your data, whatever. So.
Unfortunately, I need to get going.
Yes, on that note, it was great to see you, and we'll see you again round about the playoffs, I suppose.
That is correct. Hopefully, by this point, the next time we talk, the Boston Red Sox will have continued their march towards a World Series. And if that happens, it was because you and I did watch a game at Fenway, which was quite enjoyable.
Yes, in which I hasten to add, so we really are a good luck charm. And until next time, Blogging Hits Nation.
Take care.